Last session we discussed about working with iterations and conditions. Iterations, right? 1 second. Yep. Last session we discussed about the iterations and the iteration related various attributes, how to deal with them. And one more important thing so you need to do is we need to understand is about how we can manage the combination of iterations and conditions together. How do we deal with the iterations and conditions together? Already we know that iterations are defined by using ng for and conditions are defined by using ng if. Actually, we generally use iterations and conditions together for filtering the data. So sorting the data. For handling such interactions, we usually use iterations and conditions together. So let's see how we can manage these iterations and conditions, how we can deal with the iterations and conditions together. How do we create such example? I hope you finished that designing of the exercise I given to you. Anyone successfully done? Right? Anyone successfully able to achieve that example? I asked you to try one exercise, right? Able to do that, right? So if you have done, then you can submit in the classroom so that I can verify, right? So what you have done. Okay. Next important, I will show you just one simple example of how we can use the combination of iterations and conditions, right? Right. So let's create one component. Let's create one sub component here. I'm adding a component here and generate the component. Ng generate component. Ng generate component and conditions. Skip test. Yeah. This conditions component. Yeah, the component is generated. Let's make this conditions component in the startup. So conditions component. Okay. Index.html conditions. So how we can create the filters for accessing any specific details and displaying those details, right? Let's see. So let's go to this conditions component dot ts, right? And in this, so the ts file is not generated. Let's create the ts file. Spec file is created. So in the conditions component, we will generate the ts file. So ts file, add a new file, conditions dot component dot css is right. So ts file is generated, dot css file is not generated. We will create that. Okay. So in this file, so let's add. You can add manually, right? Already we learned. So now in this, I'm adding some data. How we generally handle the filters and all these options. One simple example to understand. So let's create some products data. Products is an array. In this, we are having objects, name, so here pods, and we have price, and some price is defined here, and some photo. So photo is from assets, and in the assets we have some earpods.jpg, right? And some category is some electronics. This belongs to electronics category. So this is products belonging to different category here we are having. Yeah, these are the details we are adding into this. Now with different types of data, we are adding into different types of data and different images, and they belong to different category also. Suppose here we are using JBL speaker.jpg, and here we have shoe.jpg, here we have shoe1.jpg, and here we are having something like shirt.jpg, here we are having like jeans.jpg, and different categories. These two categories belongs to footwear, and here we have another option, this also belongs to footwear, right? And one more option is this belongs to fashion and all, right? Like this. So these are the options here. So the fashion, okay, these are the options displayed in the background, right? Yeah. Now important is we want to display these details, and we must able to filter the details dynamically allowing to filter the data and display the data. So let's see how we can manage dynamically filtering and displaying the data. That means we are creating a UI for this in the HTML file. So we are creating an UI. So class container, okay, make it fluid here. And here we are designing a simple um, div, and let's keep this as a row. And in this we need to keep these two columns. Div class is equal to, so call 3, and another one is the, so class is equal to call 9, this is the option here, right? In this we need to display the data, so then we will create a presentation for displaying the data. In this column we are adding the options like filtering. That means we need to display all the details. Let's create a UI. Yeah, one second here. Yeah, is my voice clearer? Because the last background, in the background we have some disturbance, that is the reason. Is it okay to you? Right, no issue, na? Is it clearer? Is it clear? Is my voice clear? Right? Yeah. So no issue, na? Right. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Yes, yes. So we cannot stop the disturbing today because something happening here. So let's, if it is more disturbing, let's pause for some time. Otherwise, if not disturbing, I think we can continue, right? Is it okay, na? Audible, right? Yeah, right, right. Okay, 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 okay. Let's continue that. Right, fine. Right, so fine. It's manageable. That's great, right? Good. So let's continue. Now here you can see, so we are designing a simple card deck in that we want to display the card. So here I am using an container. I am using an ng container. ng container. So in this ng container, I am using an ng for, so let item, let item of products, and we need to design a card here. We need to design a card. So div, so we need to create a card, class as a card. So class as card, and we want to display all the products related information here. So that means I am using simple div and class as a card header. In that heading, so we are adding item dot name, and below this we are having a class as card body, and in this we are displaying an image, and image source is equal to, so this comes from item dot photo, and here we have some width is 200 or so, yeah, 200 or 100. So and height is also 100. Okay, this is the fine option available, and we will put a div and a class as card footer, and in this I just given some price here. So we need to display the price, item dot price here. Okay, now this is the details, and we presented these details, and all the details are displayed here. And let's make this as 2 and 10 columns. Okay, now let's run this and see. In the output you can see localhost, it is displaying all the cards in this way. So whatever the cards available here, I will keep a heading here. So just a heading, so class as text primary and text center, and I will keep as Amazon shopping, something like this, and this is fine, and the data is here. Now left side, I want to give an option for filtering the data. I need an option for filtering the data and displaying the data. So that means now here I am creating a filter option here. So filter option is, let's keep a div class as a form group, and here we have a label. So select category, select a category, and here we need to display a div, and inside this we need to display select a drop down. In this drop down we need to display the list of all the categories available. So and configure those list of all the categories available. That means we need to maintain all the categories in a separate location. This also we want to dynamically generate. So I am creating categories. In the categories we are adding all is the categories, and electronics is another categories, and footwear is another categories, and fashion is another categories. And we will create another property, selected category. Selected category by default we will keep as all. These categories must be added dynamically into the drop down. We have a drop down into that, we need to add them dynamically. So let's go to the design. So here class as a form control, and we need to add dynamically option into it. We have an option, and option is ng for let item of categories, and the category name must be presented here. That means the item. You can see the category names will be displayed here. So it will display like all electronics, footwear, and fashion. And when user selects the electronics or fashion or footwear, that category related products must be displayed beside here. That is what the filter generally we want to create here. That means when user selects any particular category, we need to collect the category name he selected. So we will bind here ng model and selected category. Selected category contains the name of the category. So whatever the selected category is there, it will be stored in this reference. So whichever the category is selected, that category will be stored in this reference, okay. Now once it is stored in that reference, we have to collect that here, selected category. You can see by default it is all, then obviously it will be all here, selected category. Now whenever user changes the category, that category related details must be displayed here. For that technically, so we can write an event on change. So on change, we can configure an event, we can define an event, or without an event directly we can handle, because so in the previous style we have given some example where we have written on change, because in the shopping site that we created previously, there we were changing the categories, dynamically collecting the value and defining them. Now such kind of options you can manage directly in the UI itself. That means whatever the category user selected, that category name will be stored. In this reference actually. That will be stored in this reference. Now we can use this selected category name directly and implement that to display the card. Already ng container is iterating the card. That means the for is iterating the card. Now what we need to do is we need to use a condition here. So that is ng if. Card should not be displayed. All cards should not be displayed. All cards should not be displayed. So we want only the cards to display that matches that particular condition. That means currently every item have a, you can see in the data, every item is having category as a field. Electronics, footwear, fashion category as a field. Now the card must display only the category that matches with that particular category is available. Which one user selected, based on that it should display. Now here we have to write a condition. Condition is nothing but ng if. So we say selected category is equal to all. Selected category is equal to all, or we have to write a condition here, or selected category is equal to item dot category. That means here we defined selected category is equal to item dot category. That means if the selected category is matching with any category of these items, item category is matching with selected category, then display that, because ng if is going to add or remove the cards it will remove the other cards and it will display only the cards of products whose category name is matching with this particular category user have selected. Now when you run this, you can see that, you can see here the condition. Remember, this is already an iteration. Why we are writing a container and a div separately? Why? Because already we learned the role, right? Suppose we have a div class, this is the card. So sometimes you may ask like why I cannot write ng for and in the same ng for why I cannot write ng if. Already we discussed the rule about the directive. The rule about directive is the template directives that you are using. You cannot define multiple directives in one element. Multiple directives in one element cannot be defined. So it is mandatory that every element, every HTML element can have only one directive. Multiple directives cannot be defined in one HTML element. So that is the reason, and the new element that we are adding should not disturb the structure of existing page. It should not disturb the structure of existing page. That is the reason you have to use a container. In the container, we are using the attributes, we are configuring the attributes and defining it. So that is generally how we define, how you configure here. Now, important is here user can choose the options and configure the option. And when user selects here, you see the selected category is all, or selected category is matching with any category of the item. Then you can see now I click here, and when I select electronics, important is I am using two-way binding. I don't need to write any change event. Just like previous example, we don't need to write any change event for this drop down. Why? Because this is already event binding and this is property binding. That means already it identifies the change in the value and update that value into that selected category. Any change occurred in the value will be updated into this particular category. So by default, it is event binding. It is using an event binding. So whenever you select any particular category, that category related products will come here. That means inside the iteration, we are configuring the items, and we are configuring the conditions. I selected footwear, only the footwear products will come. I selected the fashion, only the fashion products will come. And I selected all products will come. So that means here we are defining the conditions. We are defining the conditions and iterations. Iterations and conditions are together maintained inside the UI. You can define anyway. That means I am just using a drop down. So usually in websites, sometimes you see user can apply the filters. Filters are given with check boxes. Filters are given with radio buttons. Filters are given with drop downs. User can choose anything according to the requirement. Based on anything he can apply. It can be from drop down, it can be from radio, or it can be from checkbox. So just you need to implement the logic correctly, because sometimes anyone may ask you like, I want this through a checkbox so that user can display multiple items also. So you need to maintain through a checkbox, or you can define by using radios. Suppose if anyone asks like, I want a radios related option to display. Suppose I am giving another form group here. I am creating another form group here, class. So form group here. In the form group, we have a label, and again says select a category. Select a category, and below this, I am using the drop down. Previously, I was using the drop down. Now I will use an unordered list, and for this I will put the class as list unstyled. Okay, and inside this we have a list item, and list item is using input type is equal to input type is equal to radio button. Input type is equal to radio. And in the radio, so we are defining the option like radio. So this is it is having a name as some category. Category is the name, and here I am defining a value. Value is equal to all, is equal to all, and here we are writing all. That means this is the category name, and the value is all. Now the intention is nothing but how to design the radio buttons. You can even generate the radio buttons for every category and configure the radio buttons also. Dynamically, how you can control the items, dynamically how you can add elements, remove elements, those also we will discuss here. Now important is here, you can give a common name. We can give a common name for example, its name is OPT. That is an option. Option is the common name, and we should bind this. We should bind this with the ng model. It should bind with the selected category. We should bind with the selected category. That means whatever the category you are selecting, that means the radio button will have a value. So the value is all. This all value will be stored when that radio is selected. And similarly, I need other radio buttons. And as per the rules of the radio buttons, all radio buttons must have a common name. Only the value will be changing. So the value of this radio is electronics. The value of this radio is some footwear. And the value of this is fashion. Is this fashion? And we are changing the text here, say electronics, and here we have some footwear, and here we are defining fashion. And you see now here when we are configuring this, so the selected category, this is coming from a drop down, and you can see we have drop downs. And better, I will keep everything in a separate list item. I maintained everything in one item, another list item. So in the list item, second list item, the second option will be there. And in the third list item, so we have the third option here. So we have the third option here. Third list item, third option. And here we have the fourth list item and the fourth option here. So everything we are maintaining in a separate list item. Better in a new line we can manage that. That is the presentation here. And you can see here, this time here I am selecting electronics, and only electronics, footwear, fashion. You can do that. You can do that by using radios. You can do that by using drop down. You can even manage that by using checkbox. But for checkboxes, multiple options selected or not, you can manage them, and we can identify that and we can display. So checked or not, we have to identify, and we have to collect all the check boxes, and we can display. That also we can do. So that means this is without handling any type of conditions in the file, TS file. We will see in other examples how to use check boxes, how to use radio buttons, how to use drop downs combination in achieving the examples. We will see that. Sometimes even you can use a text box and ask the user to type what he is looking for. And if it is matching with this, then you can get that and we can display here and show here. That means from a text box also, you can ask the user to search for what he is looking for. So based on a product name, based on the category, you can define that and display. That means suppose you can define here the filtering options, like you can keep a text box, and through the text box you can manage that. Suppose here we defined select category. Okay, let's create another div here. So we are creating another div, and in the div, suppose we are adding here, so class form group, class as form group, and in this form group we are defining label search product. And here we are using a div and a text box. Input type is equal to text. And here, so we need to search based on that particular text user is typing class form control, and I will save this. And here we are having the text box. Now when user types any product name here, I need to search for that product name and display. I need to get the product name and display. So that means you can search based on any specific name and filter that. So you can add multiple conditions. We can define, that means here, so we have to collect the value entered in the text box. That means here we are adding, so here we are adding another property called search string. And the search string is currently empty, nothing is defined here. We will bind that search string to this particular text box, so by using ng model. And here we are using search string. So whatever the name they have entered, so based on that I need to filter and display. But for that we need to write another conditions, right? We need to configure, because currently our example doesn't suit for that, because our example is using drop down and radio, and for that we implemented. For example, I am writing here or I'm defining here search string. Search string is equal to item dot name if it is matching with item dot name. So actually there are other techniques to handle. That means here, suppose I am clicking here search string. Suppose I am searching here some Nike casuals, like this, casuals. Then it has to get only that end display. So, but important here is, so we can do that. So, but for this example doesn't suit. So why? Because in this example, in order to search and display, actually what we have to do is we need to use search conditions. So with regular expressions, that means globally managing with regular expressions, especially when you are searching for a string. Because I hope majority of you know this. When you are searching for a string and displaying string, you know JavaScript string functions. Not only JavaScript, in TypeScript also, TypeScript string functions. I told you that many JavaScript string functions are supported in TypeScript. So you can use a search method. So by using the search method, you can search for any value you are looking for. So by using global, by using I, so regular expressions, that means ignore case, globally, because generally when you are writing a string in a TypeScript and JavaScript based environment, the capitalization issues will come. We need to first collect the string, change the case, and send the new string, and based on that we need to find and display. So checkboxes and text boxes, how we can manage in filtering and sorting. A separate example I will show you how do we manage that. Here our main intention is to understand how we have to define the conditions, how we need to configure the conditions, how we need to define the conditions in the iteration and conditions combinations, mostly while working with filtering type of data, means how we can filter the data. And for that we should not use the two directives in one element. We have to maintain these ng containers for handling such iterations and conditions. Why? Because both cannot be written in one. Already I showed you that problem, that there cannot be multiple directives. They cannot be multiple directives in one element, right? That is, generally we learned two separate options. We learned ng for and we learned ng if, and we have seen how to use the combination of both of these in mostly filtering. We will see different other filtering techniques also, filtering, sorting with different types of controls in other examples with more attributes, right? So this all comes under the category of the directives called structural directives. So in Angular, you have learned two important directives. One is component directives, that we created our own directives. Another one, directives, which affect the structure. In the structural directives, so we have seen how to use ngIf, we have seen how do we use ngSwitch and ngFor, iterations and combinations, how do we handle. In Angular, another important is now attribute directives. Generally, the main purpose of attribute directives are used to extend HTML. That means already HTML is doing some work. So these directives can extend the work of HTML, make the HTML dynamic. That means actually these directives make HTML more declarative. These directives will make HTML more declarative. It becomes more declarative. So that means it converts the static HTML DOM element into the dynamic DOM element. That is what actually attribute directives. And attribute directives, already you know one. So three important attribute directives are there. ng model is an attribute directive, ng class is an attribute directive, and ng style is an attribute directive. Three attribute directives are there. We have ng model, ng class, and ng style. These are the three attribute directives. So what is the purpose of ng model? Already I told you. Because ng model we have used to store the data of a value entered inside any specific control. That means suppose we are using input type is equal to text. Now what ng model does is it makes it dynamic. It creates a reference name, and whatever the value comes in that, it will store in that reference name. So ng model is extending this text box and making the text box dynamic, so that whatever the value entered in the text box can be collected and can be stored in some reference. So already we saw that ng model is doing that work. Not only text box, suppose you are using a drop down, so that means it is using ng model. This already I told you. Suppose opt city is equal to ng model, it is going to manage. So ng model is an attribute directive that extends HTML element, that makes the HTML element more declarative. It makes the HTML element dynamic, and it can store its value dynamically and use in the UI. That's what actually ng model can do. And already we used in two-way binding technique, we learned how to use this ng model. Actually, it comes under the category of attribute directive, structural directives and attribute directives. So difference between structural and attribute directive is structural directive affect the DOM structure. That means adding elements, removing elements, iterating elements, all this. Attribute directives doesn't affect the structure, they extend HTML. They make the HTML more effective. So another directive called ng class. ng class is simple. Actually, ng class is nothing but it is a structural directive which is used to apply any CSS class dynamically. That means you can apply any CSS class dynamically. This is very much required. Why? Because especially when you are dealing with validations. So according to our situation, the appearance, the effects should change dynamically. According to the situation, according to the condition, it should change dynamically. That means ng class allows to change the effects of any element dynamically. So for example, you are using validations. If it is valid, then it should display some color. If it is invalid, it should display some another color. Actually, directly CSS now, I hope if you know CSS CSS4. CSS4 introduced several validation styles. So validation selectors actually. I hope majority of you know that. By using these validation selectors, you can manage the functionality. You can manage the functionality by using the validation selectors in CSS4 actually. So, but some dynamically we need to manage. Dynamically we need to manage. That you can do by using the HTML. So, and the combination of these attribute directive. So CSS4 already have validation selectors. You can use validation selectors like it is having valid, it is having like invalid, it is having like range, in range, it is having like in range, it is having out of range, and it is having required, it is having like optional, so it is having like checked. These are all CSS4 validation selectors actually. Now, after introducing CSS4 validation selectors, dynamically displaying the effects for elements became very easy now. We don't need to do much JavaScript also, but certain things we cannot. So that is the reason we need a combination of both of them. Certain things we cannot achieve directly. So that is the reason we need combination. CSS4 already have that. I will show you just an example here. CSS4 is already having the validations. For example, I will give you here. Simple. For example, suppose let me put some form for you, just for understanding sake. Suppose there is a text box here. I am adding another div class as a form group, and here we are having a div, so some username, and here we are having, a span, so username, or say div, yeah, username required. So here let's keep here a label. So label username, and we will keep a text box, and input type is equal to text. Now actually in HTML we can just put an option here. So this text box we can give here as required. I am giving required as an attribute for this. Required as an attribute. Now important is, if this text box is having the class, let's put a class as suppose txt name. Txt name is the class. So that means this is the class name we given for that. Txt name is the class. Okay. And this is the message we need to display. That means below that we need to display. So this is the span. We need to display some message, name required. So here just I am giving name required. Generally, the approach is nothing but, suppose, so username is not entered, then it should show that message there. It should show some red color, so it should apply some effects and display that. Generally what happens is, suppose we need to handle that, right? If we need to handle this, by default you can see now I am adding here the CSS. In the CSS file here, in the component TS, the CSS file is not defined. Styles URL. So comes from, yeah, styles URL is coming from, so conditions dot component dot CSS. It is coming from that CSS file. And in this CSS file, I am writing here, so .txt name, that is the class. This txt name, if it is required, there is an option required. If it is required, then what should happen is it should display in red color. Or so if it is required, if it is having a required error, so then we need to display. So I will give here as a plus span. span. So that means the span beside it. So span beside it. So we will keep as a display. So display block, and we have color as red color we need to display. And if txt name dot we have optional, we have an optional, then the span should display. So that means we have to use the span display, and we need to use span display as none, So this is the conditions actually. This is the style. That means, for example, here, so you can see here, so the options we are defining and applying here, the effects and CSS need to be applied for that. Usually what happens is, this is txt name is the class given for this element. Txt name is the class given for that. And if it is required, then it should display that, and it have to apply the effect. Now it is going to manage these conditions by using these attributes. That means if this is indicating that the adjacent span, when you are typing here, so CSS can manage that condition, Currently something here, so some issue here. I will check what is problem. Txt name is the class defined for here, right? So this is name required, and if it is not defined, so means txt name is not defined, then you can see here the text box, the span is not displayed here. Now suppose I am adding, that means username required option is not displayed here. And when I add this as a required, I'm adding required here. When I add required, automatically this message will be displayed there. You can see that message will be displayed there, name required. In red color, it is displaying that. But actually what should happen is, when user enters the name, so enters the value. So because usually this should have a name is equal to some txt name also defined. Generally these kind of validations cannot be handled. So without a form, I entered some name into this and you kept in a form. This requires form. We have to design in form. Then they can dynamically manage. Manage means when you entered the name, automatically this message will be removed. So when you make it optional, because I need to keep that inside a form, because these validations cannot work without the form. Form must be there and it must be configured. So there must be form. So later in form validations, I will show you clearly. But remember, so when I remove this required. When I remove this required, automatically you can see that if required is not there, then the message will not be there. That means even dynamically also it can manage that colors and effects by using these attributes. So CSS4 have already introduced these things and we can handle them. But these have certain restrictions. Dynamically they can control. I hope you have heard now latest version of Bootstrap. Bootstrap latest version is 5. Do you know Bootstrap latest version 5 have removed jQuery? Without jQuery, CSS and HTML can manage all the functionalities dynamically. Have you gone through that Bootstrap 5? Do you have idea? Na? Have you seen that Bootstrap 5 new version? Bootstrap 5 new version, have you seen? Bootstrap 5 is the new version. Earlier Bootstrap requires jQuery. Now Bootstrap 5 doesn't require jQuery. Without jQuery, you can manage all the dynamic interactions with HTML and CSS only. That's what the new Bootstrap is. Bootstrap 5 comes with that abilities actually. These are all available now. But so Angular provides, say, a class, ng class, which allows you to dynamically apply the classes for the elements and manage the classes for the elements. So what are the various techniques, how we can apply the dynamic classes? So, and validations, how we manage these validations by using this ng class, that we will see one example. So better that we will see in our next session. Tomorrow we will continue. Today we have a little bit disturbance in this in the background, that is the reason, right? Tomorrow we will continue, right? Tomorrow we will have session, no off here. So tomorrow we will have the session, and tomorrow we will continue with these attribute directives with example. Okay, right?